At exactly 7:42 a.m., on March 14, 1941, a cold wind swept across the airfield at RAF Kenley. Beatrice Tilly Schilling stood near the runway, coat pulled tight, watching a young Hurricane pilot prepare for takeoff. It could be his last mission, and she knew, deep down, that the problem killing these men was still unsolved. She was 32, an engineer with 6 relentless years at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. And despite all that work, she still hadn't found a fix for the mysterious engine failures crippling Britain's best fighters. That week alone, the German Luftwaffe had sent more than 40 Messerschmitt Bf-109s across the Channel. The RAF had met them in over 24 dogfights. 14 Hurricanes and 9 Spitfires never came back. The pattern was always the same. A British pilot spotted the enemy, pushed his aircraft into a sharp dive. And then, silence. The Merlin engine would cough, sputter, and die. In those deadly 1.5 seconds, the German fighter would loop back and fire, turning a stall into a death sentence. Schilling had studied every report, every piece of wreckage, every frightened pilot's account. The cause was clear and cruelly simple. During negative G maneuvers, the carburetor flooded. The fuel surged upward, starving the engine just when the pilot needed it most. The Germans didn't face this. Their Daimler-Benz engines used direct fuel injection. No float chamber, no flooding, no hesitation. A Messerschmitt could dive, roll, or flip upside down without missing a beat. That single mechanical difference gave the enemy a devastating edge in every battle. The RAF knew it. Pilots cursed it. Commanders reported it. But the fix, a pressure carburetor from Rolls-Royce, was still years away. Maybe 1943, maybe longer. The war, however, wasn't waiting. Every dawn, new pilots strapped themselves into Hurricanes and Spitfires, knowing that one wrong move in a dive could silence their own engines permanently. That morning, Squadron Leader Davies walked past Schilling toward his aircraft. Just 24 years old, 41 missions behind him, 3 enemy kills to his name. Twice his engine had failed in combat. Twice he'd lived by instinct and luck. He gave a brief nod to the woman on the tarmac, probably assuming she was a secretary or clerk. He had no idea she was the one fighting a different kind of battle, against physics itself. What she carried in her gloved hand that morning was tiny, no bigger than a coin. A small brass part, simple in shape but powerful in purpose. It wasn't a miracle, but it might just be enough to save them. For 6 long weeks, Schilling's team at the Royal Aircraft Establishment ran the new design through endless bench tests. Engines roared, sputtered, and steadied. And finally, it worked. On the test stand, the fix held perfectly. But Beatrice knew a bench wasn't a battlefield. A real fight meant 300 miles per hour, crushing G-forces, and pilots blacking out while trying to keep their engines alive. If her idea failed up there, it wouldn't just cost planes, it would cost lives. She zipped up her leather jacket, slung her satchel over her shoulder, and wheeled her old Norton motorcycle toward the gate. Inside the bag was that small brass part, her restrictor, and a bold plan that might save the Royal Air Force, or end her career before lunch. The trouble had begun nearly a year earlier, back in July 1940, when the RAF switched to 100-octane fuel. It gave the Merlin engine an incredible boost, from 100 horsepower to more than 300. Spitfires could now match the Messerschmitt 109s in speed, even outclimb them on a good day. But the Skinner's Union carburetor wasn't built for those violent combat dives. Under negative G, the fuel surged upward and drowned the system. Power vanished. The enemy didn't. Schilling knew carburetors like other people knew poetry. She'd joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment in late 1939, one of only 2 women in the engine department. The other took dictation. Schilling ran experiments. While some of her colleagues whispered about whether a woman belonged there at all, she didn't bother to argue. Her focus was simple: stop the dying. Engines had been part of her life since she was a teenager. At 14, she'd saved up for her first Norton motorcycle, taken it apart piece by piece, and rebuilt it just to understand what made it breathe. By 25, she was racing that same machine at Brooklands, clocking an average speed of 106 miles per hour, fast enough to earn the British Motorcycle Racing Club's Gold Star, an honor only a handful of women had ever achieved. Racing had taught her what stress did to machinery, how heat, gravity, and speed worked together to break even the strongest engine. She could feel a misfire before a gauge showed it. That instinct made her the most skilled carburetor engineer in Britain, and now, perhaps, the only one who could save its pilots. Then, one winter morning in January, the idea struck her. If gravity was forcing too much fuel into the chamber during dives, why not limit the flow itself? Not block it, just control it. A small brass disc, drilled with a single, precise hole, narrow enough to stop flooding, wide enough to keep the Merlin breathing at full power. She'd made the first one herself, hand-machined in the Farnborough workshop. A brass thimble, barely an inch wide, simple to look at, yet capable of changing everything. The hole at the center of her brass washer measured just 0.04 of an inch, a number that could mean the difference between life and death. Make it too wide, and the carburetor would still drown in fuel. Too narrow, and the Merlin would choke under full throttle. Schilling had tested 17 variations before finding the one that struck the perfect balance. Then she refined it again, turning the thimble-shaped piece into a simple flat washer. Easy to make, easy to install, easy to replace. Her test engines ran flawlessly. In simulated dives, the fuel flow stayed steady. For the first time in months, the problem looked solved. But a lab wasn't a battlefield. A hurricane diving through gunfire didn't behave like a test stand bolted to the floor. To prove her design, she needed a live trial. In the sky, at full speed, under real combat stress. That was the problem. She didn't have clearance. Installing an unapproved modification on an RAF aircraft wasn't just bending the rules, it was breaking dozens of them. If anything went wrong, if a pilot died with her washer inside the fuel line, she'd be finished. Court-martialed. Possibly imprisoned. She decided to take the risk anyway. Better to face the wrath of bureaucracy than watch more pilots die because of paperwork. That morning at Kenley, she had 6 of the tiny brass washers tucked safely in her satchel, and one trusted ally. Sergeant William Cooper, a seasoned ground mechanic, had been tending Merlin engines for 3 years. He'd watched 19 pilots fail to return home after their engines cut out mid-dive. When Schilling showed him the small, gleaming disc, he didn't question her. He simply nodded, rolled up his sleeves, and grabbed his tools. On the dispersal pad, Squadron Leader Davies sat inside his Hurricane, engine idling at a low growl, minutes from takeoff. Cooper moved fast, disconnecting the fuel line between the pump and carburetor. Schilling handed him the washer. He slid it into place and sealed it with a tiny flame from his butane torch. 1 minute of quiet, precise work, and it was done. The modification was invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Schilling leaned in to inspect the weld. Clean, perfect. She said nothing. Davies still thought she was just another visitor from Farnborough, not the woman who had just altered the heart of his engine. No one else on the base knew. There were no reports, no signatures, no permissions. If it failed, there would be no defense, just a downed plane and an unexplained brass washer. Davies throttled up. The Merlin roared to life, smooth and powerful. Oil pressure steady, coolant normal. Magnetos firing on all 12 cylinders. He released the brakes, and the Hurricane surged forward, wheels lifting into the cold March air. Schilling's eyes followed the climb. 800 feet, 2,200, 2,000, until the fighter banked south toward the channel. 2 more Hurricanes rose to join him, forming a three-ship patrol heading for Dungeness, where German fighters had been sighted all week. She raised her binoculars, tracking the formation until it became a trio of silver dots in the pale sky. If Davies met a Messerschmitt today, the truth would reveal itself. Either her restrictor would hold, or everything she'd risked would come crashing down. She waited. Cooper stood silently beside her. Around them, the airfield hummed with war, engines testing, mechanics shouting, a fuel truck rumbling past. But Schilling heard none of it. In her mind, she was running equations again. 0.04 inches. Maximum flow rate, 1.5 seconds of negative G. The math worked perfectly on paper, but math wasn't combat. 40 minutes passed, then an hour, and still no word from the patrol. The airfield was quiet except for the low hum of distant engines. Radio silence from Davies's section stretched minute after minute, and every one of them felt longer than the last. It could mean anything. No contact or too much contact. It could mean they were fighting for their lives, or already gone. Then, at 09:37, the radio crackled to life. A voice from the control tower, calm, almost casual. 3 hurricanes inbound. 2 minutes out, Schilling froze. 3? That meant all of them. She grabbed her binoculars and scanned the pale morning sky. And there they were. 3 dark silhouettes descending toward the field, wings gleaming in the weak sun. No losses, no smoke, no flames. Her heart was pounding. She didn't move until Davies's hurricane touched down, bounced once, and rolled to a stop near the dispersal pad. He cut the engine, unstrapped, and climbed out. She walked toward him, hands trembling despite herself. She'd designed bombs before. She'd tested engines in labs under every imaginable condition. But this, sending a pilot into combat with an unapproved part, this was different. This was personal. Davies pulled off his helmet, and he was smiling. Not that hollow, exhausted grin pilots gave after surviving another day, but a real smile, alive and triumphant. It was the first one she'd seen in months. Sergeant Cooper spoke first. "Any trouble with the engine, sir?" Davies looked from Cooper to Schilling, then back again. "Trouble?" he said, grinning wider. "That was the best she's ever run." He went on to describe the fight. 2 Messerschmitts spotted at 14,000 feet, heading east toward France. Davies had the altitude advantage and pushed into a steep dive. Nearly 400 miles an hour. Negative G pressing hard against his harness. The kind of dive that always killed the engine. But not this time. The Merlin roared clean and steady all the way down. No sputter, no stall, no hesitation. Davies closed to 200 yards before the Germans even saw him coming. A short, 3-second burst, tracer fire across the sky, and one Messerschmitt broke hard right, trailing smoke. The other fled. Davies pulled up into a climb, full power, no engine cutout. It was the first successful diving attack he'd managed in almost a year. When he asked what had changed, Schilling told him. The brass washer, the restrictor, a simple piece of metal that stopped the flooding. Davies stared at her for a long moment, then turned to Cooper. "Put that thing in every hurricane on this field," he said. Schilling hesitated. "It's not authorized," she reminded him quietly. Davies shook his head. "If the Air Ministry wants to court-martial me, they can do it after the war. Right now, I need engines that don't die when I dive." By that afternoon, Cooper had installed 4 more washers. Schilling had brought 6. She kept one for testing and used the rest for combat. Over the next 3 days, 5 Hurricanes flew patrols fitted with her restrictor. Not a single engine failure. 12 diving attacks, 12 successful engagements. Pilots came back grinning, swearing their Merlins had never run smoother. Some even claimed they felt stronger at altitude. Word spread like wildfire through the squadrons. And just like that, Beatrice Schilling's tiny brass washer, no bigger than a coin, had done what bureaucracy couldn't. It kept Britain's best in the fight. By March 18th, word had spread like wildfire through every RAF base in the south of England. Squadron commanders in No. 11 Group were all saying the same thing. They wanted that brass washer, and they wanted it now. Schilling's phone at Farnborough rang non-stop, 14 calls in 2 days. Captains, engineers, flight leaders, all begging the same question. Can you come to our station? Can you bring more? How quickly can we get them made? The design worked. That was no longer in doubt. The problem was supply. She'd made only 6 by hand in the RAE workshop. 6 tiny pieces of brass that had already changed everything. But to equip every Spitfire and Hurricane in service, she needed thousands. That meant factories, tooling, raw materials, and government approval. So she went straight to the top. The Air Ministry didn't hesitate. 4 days later, her design was approved, stamped, and pushed into immediate production. Officials called it a war-winning modification. Rolls-Royce received the order to begin manufacturing 500 units a week to start. The plan was ambitious. Retrofit every operational fighter in Britain without pulling a single one out of service. Schilling put together a small traveling team. 3 engineers from Farnborough, 2 civilian mechanics, all volunteers. They'd move base to base, supervising installations right on the tarmac. The brass washer could be fitted in minutes, and that speed was crucial. The skies were still dangerous. German fighters still crossed the Channel every day. Fighter Command couldn't afford to lose a single aircraft to downtime. Schilling loaded her old Norton motorcycle again. Panniers packed with tools, spare washers, and a hand-drawn map marked with every RAF station she'd visited before the war. She knew the roads, the crews, and the faces waiting for her. But this time, she wasn't coming to inspect engines. She was bringing a solution. A small circle of brass that meant survival. By March 25th, production was in full swing. 600 restrictors built, 40 airfields scheduled, and nearly 3,000 Merlin engines waiting for their upgrade. The next morning, March 26th, she rode north toward Biggin Hill, the busiest station in No. 11 Group. 4 squadrons rotated through there, 32 Spitfires and 21 Hurricanes, all flying constant combat patrols. When she arrived at 0800, Group Captain Grace met her at the gate himself. His expression said everything. 7 pilots lost in 2 months, all to the same engine failure. He didn't bother with introductions. "Get them installed," he said, and so they did. Ground crews worked in shifts, 4 aircraft at a time, engines cooling, wrenches clattering, cigarette smoke curling through the morning air. Schilling moved among them. Leather jacket, oil-stained gloves, eyes sharp with purpose, watching the washers go in one by one. A handful of small, shining discs, disappearing into the fuel lines of Britain's fighters. Simple, elegant, life-saving. Each installation took just 12 minutes. Disconnect the fuel line, slip the brass restrictor into place, weld it carefully, reconnect, test for leaks. Every weld had to be flawless. 1 weak join at 15,000 feet could starve the engine and send the pilot plunging to the ground. Schilling oversaw every single one herself. She inspected each weld, double-checked every connection, and rejected 3 restrictors that didn't meet her exacting standards. Pilots watched closely, curious, skeptical, hopeful. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey had flown 41 combat missions. Twice his engine had failed at the worst possible moment. He leaned over to Schilling, asking how such a tiny washer could fix a problem that had killed so many men. She calmly explained fuel flow, float chamber physics, and the deadly effect of negative G on liquid fuel. Lacey, an engineering graduate from Cambridge, nodded in admiration. "Brilliant simplicity," he said. By March 28th, All 53 Merlin engines at Biggin Hill had been upgraded. Schilling moved on to Hornchurch, North Weald, and Tangmere, repeating the process at every station. Ground crews worked 12-hour shifts, while pilots flew patrols with the modified engines. Not a single failure reported. The restrictor performed exactly as designed. The nickname came next. Sir Stanley Hooker, chief engineer at Rolls-Royce's Supercharger division, dubbed it Miss Schilling's Orifice. Slightly crude, a little irreverent, perfect British humor. Schilling didn't mind. After 6 years working with RAF crews, she understood their ways. If a nickname helped men remember and trust a life-saving modification, she'd accept it without complaint. The name spread faster than the washers themselves. By April, every pilot and squadron commander knew it. Some refused to fly combat missions without it. Others demanded it be installed immediately. Commanders backed them. Too many lives had already been lost to a preventable flaw. Even German intelligence noticed the change. Luftwaffe after-action reports in early April recorded that British fighters no longer faltered in dives. Spitfires and Hurricanes now held their own in negative G maneuvers. Messerschmitt pilots could no longer exploit the carburetor weakness. The tactical advantage they'd relied on for months had vanished. By mid-April, Schilling's team had installed the restrictor in 2,100 Merlin engines, every operational Spitfire and Hurricane, every training aircraft, every reserve plane. It became standard equipment. New fighters rolling off production lines at Castle Bromwich and Southampton came pre-fitted. The long-awaited pressure carburetor was still years from production, scheduled for 1943, but the restrictor worked so flawlessly that some engineers began to wonder if it would ever be necessary. One small piece of brass, born from 6 years of quiet, relentless work, had saved the lives of countless RAF pilots and changed the air war forever. Why go through the effort of redesigning the entire fuel system when a tiny brass washer solved the problem? Schilling knew the answer. Miss Schilling's Orifice was a stopgap. A brilliant, life-saving one. But temporary. The real solution was the pressure carburetor. That system would eliminate negative G issues entirely. No restrictions, no compromises. Full engine power under any maneuver. That was proper engineering. Until 1943, though, the washer kept pilots alive. And that was all that mattered. The results were immediate and undeniable. Fighter Command kept meticulous records, tracking every engagement, every kill, every loss. In March 1941, before the restrictor, engine failures occurred in 38% of diving attacks. Pilots were forced to break off their dives. Enemy fighters escaped, sometimes fatally exploiting the Merlin's weakness. Messerschmitt pilots learned to bait British aircraft into steep dives, confident the engines would fail. By April, after the restrictor, the numbers were staggering. Engine failures during diving attacks dropped to 0.4%, almost zero. The few failures that did happen were unrelated to the carburetor. Battle damage, mechanical issues, normal combat attrition. Confidence soared. The kill-to-loss ratio reflected it. March had been grim. 47 Hurricanes and Spitfires lost. 61 German aircraft destroyed. Barely above parity at 1.3 to 1. April was a different story. Only 29 British fighters lost, while 94 German aircraft were destroyed. A ratio of 3.2 to 1. Pilots and commanders credited the restrictor as a major factor. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck of Duxford knew it firsthand. He had suffered 4 engine failures before the modification. After installation, he pressed diving attacks with total confidence, destroying 3 Messerschmitt 109s in May and 2 more in June. He credited the washer with giving him the courage to commit fully to aggressive tactics. The modification didn't just save lives, it changed the way British pilots fought. Word spread beyond fighter command. Every pilot who flew a Merlin wanted it. Every squadron wanted it, and every aircraft that rolled off production lines soon came fitted with the tiny brass piece that had turned the tide. The success of Miss Schilling's orifice didn't go unnoticed. Requests poured in from every corner of the RAF. Coastal Command wanted them for their Beaufighters. Bomber Command demanded them for training aircraft. Even the Fleet Air Arm asked about fitting them on carrier-based fighters. Schilling coordinated production with Rolls-Royce, and by June 1941, the factory was cranking out 1,000 washers a week. The little brass restrictor remained in frontline service until 1943, saving lives daily. Finally, in January 1943, Rolls-Royce introduced the long-awaited pressure carburetor. It solved the negative G problem completely, using fuel injection like the German engines, no float chamber, no flooding, flawless power in every maneuver. But upgrading the entire RAF fleet was a slow process. Converting older aircraft required removing carburetors, installing new fuel pumps, rewiring controls, 8 hours per plane. Fighter Command couldn't afford to take squadrons out of the air for that long, so the restrictors stayed in service. Many planes flew with Miss Schilling's orifice until 1944. Some carried them right to the end of the war. New production, Spitfires and Hurricanes, rolled off assembly lines with pressure carburetors. But older aircraft kept the washer. Pilots trusted it. Ground crews knew it. If it worked, why change it? Schilling moved on to other challenges. She tackled cold-weather starting systems for engines in Iceland and Russia, researched high-altitude fuel mixture problems, and helped design improved superchargers for late-war Merlin variants. The Royal Aircraft Establishment kept her occupied with dozens of pressing technical problems. Yet, her tiny brass washer remained her most celebrated contribution. Pilots remembered it. Engineers studied it. Aviation schools after the war taught it as a masterclass in elegant problem-solving. A simple solution, applied immediately with measurable results. Everything good engineering should be. Keith Maddock, chief engineer at Hangar 42, reflected years later. Beatrice Schilling helped us win World War II. Of that, there is no doubt. The restrictor had truly been a war-winning modification. And while her career at Farnborough would span decades, tackling one technical challenge after another, engine failures at high altitude, fuel system icing, Arctic cold starts, it was the little brass washer that saved lives, turned the tide in the skies, and cemented her legacy. In temperatures plunging to -40 Fahrenheit over Russia, every problem she solved meant pilots came home alive. And that was what mattered most. Winter in Russia and Northern Europe was brutal. Standard engine oil thickened to sludge. Batteries died. Fuel lines froze. British pilots couldn't even start their aircraft. Soviet ground crews, unfamiliar with Merlin engines, struggled alongside them. Schilling developed a cold start procedure using preheated oil and adjusted fuel mixtures. It worked. Spitfires took to the skies over Murmansk through the freezing winter of 1941. She didn't stop there. High-altitude flight posed a different challenge. Late-war Spitfire variants climbed above 35,000 feet. Thin air, low oxygen, and finicky fuel mixtures threatened engine performance. Too rich and the engine flooded. Too lean and it overheated. Schilling designed altitude-compensating carburetor modifications that boosted power output by 8% above 30,000 feet. Her personal life was kept carefully separate from her work. She had married George Naylor in September 1938. He was an aerodynamicist at Farnborough and, when war broke out, volunteered for RAF Bomber Command. Naylor flew Avro Lancasters with 625 Squadron, completing 31 perilous missions over Germany. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for an extra tour beyond his required missions. Schilling feared for him constantly. She understood the grim odds. Half of bomber crews didn't survive the war. Naylor beat the odds and returned safely in 1944. At home, they rarely discussed work. She never asked about his missions. He never asked about her projects. Work and marriage existed in separate compartments. Schilling still found time for motorcycles. Though the Brooklyn racing circuit had been converted to aircraft production, she continued riding her Norton. High-speed rides along country roads helped her think. Some of her best engineering breakthroughs came at 90 mm, when mind and machine were in perfect sync. By 1945, she had worked on 17 major projects: cold weather systems, high-altitude carburetor adjustments, fuel mixture optimization, supercharger efficiency upgrades, each one saving lives, keeping aircraft flying in extreme conditions. Yet none achieved the fame of the brass restrictor. That little washer had earned her a permanent place in RAF history. The war ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered. Japan followed in August. Farnborough shifted from urgent wartime projects to slower, peacetime research. Schilling stayed. Engineering was her life. In 1948, her contributions were formally recognized. King George VI appointed her Officer of the Order of the British Empire. At Buckingham Palace, she wore her formal dress, accepted the medal, posed for photographs, and then returned to work at Farnborough the next morning. She never stopped engineering, never stopped solving problems, never stopped proving that women belonged in technical fields. Her career at the Royal Aircraft Establishment would continue for another 21 years. But the brass washer, Miss Schilling's orifice, remained her enduring legacy, the simple, brilliant invention that had saved the Royal Air Force and countless lives. Beatrice Schilling remained at the Royal Aircraft Establishment until 1969. 33 years of unbroken service. She never rose to the top administrative posts. Those positions were reserved for men. And RAF leadership didn't promote women to director-level roles, no matter their accomplishments. Schilling accepted the barrier. She preferred being hands-on, solving real engineering problems, laboratory testing, field modifications, tangible work with real-world impact. Her post-war projects were as varied as they were critical. She contributed to the Blue Streak missile program, Britain's first ballistic missile, focusing on fuel delivery systems and high-altitude performance. She studied wet runway braking for jet aircraft, a surprising but vital field, since landing accidents now killed more pilots than engine failures. Her research, published in 3 technical papers, helped improve safety and save lives. Even the unusual found her expertise. Schilling helped design a bobsled for the Royal Air Force Olympic team. It may have seemed odd for an aeronautical engineer, but aerodynamics, weight distribution, and friction management were her specialty. The RAF team didn't win medals, but they finished every run safely, a testament to her design. She retired in 1969 at age 60 and returned to her first love: motorcycles. She restored vintage machines, raced at classic events, and maintained her Norton, the same bike she'd owned since 1934, the one that had taught her how engines responded under extreme stress. Schilling passed away on November 18, 1990, at the age of 81. She was survived by her husband, George, and a lifetime of engineering achievements. British obituaries celebrated her for one thing above all: the brass washer, Miss Schilling's orifice. Her other contributions were footnotes, yet her impact lived on in ways both quiet and profound. In 2011, a pub in Farnborough was renamed the Tilly Schilling. In 2015, Brooklyn's museum acquired her racing trophies and badges. Winchester Heritage honored her in 2018 as one of Hampshire's extraordinary women. And in 2019, Royal Holloway University opened the Beatrice Schilling Building for Electronic Engineering students, a lasting tribute to a pioneer who had spent her life proving that women could lead in technical fields. On March 8, 2019, the people of Waterville gathered as their mayor revealed a special plaque at the local library, 110 years after her birth. The focus wasn't just the plaque itself, but the story behind it. Beatrice Schilling the engineer behind a tiny but life-saving invention, turned a simple idea into a global lesson. Her restrictor became more than a tool. It became a symbol of smart, efficient engineering. Universities around the world studied it. It solved a critical problem quickly, especially under wartime pressure. The results were measurable, lives were saved, and all of it came from a simple, elegant solution. Some schools even kept the original pieces on display, small brass washers preserved in glass cases. A quiet reminder that brilliance doesn't need complexity. If this story moves you like it moved us, show some love. Hit that like button. Every click tells YouTube that stories like Beatrice's matter. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We dig through dusty archives every day to bring forgotten heroes back into the light. Engineers, inventors, everyday people who changed the world in small but powerful ways. And right now, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Texas, Germany, Japan, anywhere in the world. You're more than a viewer. You're helping keep these memories alive. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure Beatrice Schilling isn't forgotten. She earned her place in history, and together we make sure her story lives on. Story lives on.